everyone! Welcome to today's Patreon exclusive video. Today I'm going to be talking about drawing hair and also how I shade hair in general. And then also I'm also going to be talking about blending. So thank you guys so much for all the requests under one of my latest posts, and I'm going to be doing all the videos that you requested kind of like one after another. So this is the one that I'm starting with. And I have a reference here on the side. The app that I use to organize my references is called WizRef, and this is just the first hair reference that popped up on Pinterest, and I felt like it kind of, it worked really well since she is very vertical and then also has just really beautiful hair. So I just chose her quickly so I wouldn't spend hours looking for the perfect reference. So what I'm starting with is I'm just choosing a bluish kind of color, and then I'm just starting with the circles that I like to use to kind of indicate the proportions. So one of the blue circles stands for her head size, and now I start laying in the rough sketch. So I took you guys a little bit closer to kind of show you what I've done so far. So right now I did the sketch, and what I like to do for the sketch is to kind of get the overall shape of the hair, but then also look at the individual hair chunks or parts that she has. So for example, we have this swoopy kind of chunk here that I did here, or then we have this one that is kind of rolling around here and then kind of coming here, which I have right there, and then just the other stuff that's going on. I just kind of map these out, and I try to keep my lines pretty flowy and pretty quick, just to not lose too much of the movement. And I also don't define anything too specific yet. Then I also add just more exaggerated strands. So for example, here I add stuff like this. So these kind of strands where I have the main thing and then add this kind of, and then, you know, add one of these. I feel like these are really handy to do in hair in general to make it look really nice and flowy, and just kind of try to look at the direction of the chunks and how they flow, just to kind of emulate it and maybe add my own kind of touch to it as well. What I now do is I lower the opacity of my sketch, and then I choose a darker color and I go in with lines, and as always I'm using the Clean Inka, the Sable Inka Clean from the Comics Max pack. And now I just kind of go over the sketch with my lines, obviously, and just kind of refine everything. And I try to pay attention to giving the hair balanced shapes. So I will try to make sure that there are big shapes that the eye can rest in, and then on the side also smaller shapes with more detail to just, you know, add detail and to make it look balanced. So we have contrast between high and low detail areas, which is going to overall make it look more interesting. So that's what I'm going to do right now. So now you can watch me lay in the hair bit by bit, or just kind of part by part. And what is most important here is that I have a strong foundation in the sketch. So I have all the main hair chunks already mapped out. So I can go into each individual chunk and really make sure that there is a nice balance between all the shapes, and I can focus on adding more detail and just refining everything a bit more. When it comes to stylizing hair, you don't have to beat yourself up if you don't really know what you should do, or if you haven't found the way you like to stylize it yet. That will obviously come naturally, but something you can always do is look at your favorite artists and really see and really observe how they stylize hair, or how they also stylize different parts of the hair. So what I did when I started drawing hair or stylizing it, I looked at my favorite artist, and you can maybe still see the influence. I mainly referenced Arina Tanemura back then, so I would take a drawing of hers and then I would basically copy the way she drew the hair line for line in my sketchbook, and I would look at I would just observe the kind of patterns she would draw and the kind of patterns that I would like in there, and then I try to apply it to my own hair that I would draw then on my own. And that's the main way that has worked for me. And then just by having a really good reference and adding that stylization training that you did together, you're going to be able to draw really nice hair. Obviously, I don't want you to just copy someone else's way of drawing hair. I want you to also look at different artists and just kind of look at what you like most about their hair, and then just bring it together and make something of your own. So I have everything lined, and I also added some base colors. So now I'm going to show you how I do all my shading for hair, or how I shade hair every single time. I start with a new layer, clip that to the hair layer, and the first thing I always do is I start with some gradients. So I use a super soft airbrush, a pretty big one, and then I just start making the top of the hair darker and making the bottom of the hair lighter. I'm probably going to go for some kind of ombre hair look with her. That's what I'm feeling today. And you can see I don't really do any blending or anything. The airbrush does most of the work for me. So for anyone who asks me about blending, I don't really blend at all. I don't use the smudging brush or anything. What I like to do is to pick colors and then go in with an airbrush, and that usually does the trick for me. There are also soft blend airbrushes, so when I do more of like a painted portrait, which I don't do a lot, but if I do, I like to use these because they really nicely blend the colors together. So that's a tip if you want to go more into blending. The next thing I do is I add some of the skin color into the hair. It kind of mimics the way the skin would be shining through the hair. And now the next clipping mask that I do is a multiply layer. So I go multiply, choose roughly this kind of color mostly for brown hair. And then I use the brush that I line with, and I just add shading. It's pretty simple, and I don't really overthink this too much. I lower down the opacity of this anyway, so you don't have to be too meticulous, but you know, just to add some depth. I mainly look at the way I drew the lines and then try to make the shading kind of follow what I did there. So you can kind of see here, I follow this line first and then I kind of shade underneath here. You can also look at the reference. So for example, right here, her hair obviously is a lot darker. So those are areas that I would later on go in to make darker as well with a second multiply layer. So for now, we're just adding more dimension. You can kind of see how it just makes the hair look more refined. And then later on, I'm going to make some areas even darker. And I also just use this step to add more detail in, just in general, to the hair. I don't want to add too many lines. This is like the maximum amount of lines that I would ever typically do. So what I like to do is to use the shading to add even more lines without adding more lines, if that makes sense. So now that I have pretty much everything somewhat shaded, like I said, make another clipping mask and make another multiply layer. And now we are going in and adding some more depth or some deeper shadows. I'm going to do this by making or using my airbrush again. Here I'm going to erase the areas where I don't want the airbrush to be. This is going to add even more dimension because the overlapping hair doesn't have the extra airbrush. And I think I'm also going to maybe add some more of that light ombre color to the tips here to make them stand out even more. Lowering the opacity, and because I'm using multiply layers, these affect everything. So these also affect the gradient, and you don't have to just use one color to shade with. It will kind of adapt and just make everything darker around the same way. I know this was kind of a clumsy way to explain, but it just multiplies with the brightness or darkness of the color underneath. So it doesn't matter how bright or dark the color is underneath. So now I'm going to add some of that lighter ombre color into the tips right here and erase them everywhere that I don't want them to be as light. So right here. So what I like to do is to do a clipping mask and then add in, let's see, this kind of color maybe. Add in some of that color variation into the shadows. Right here, for example. This would just add some more variation. I just like the way it looks as well. And then lower the opacity again. Maybe I'm going to make this even less saturated. Yeah. So you just have these slight variations. It's nothing special, but I just like to do it. And now you can, if you want to, add another layer and add some kind of light source if you want. I don't always do this, so you could kind of make these parts of the hair brighter, assuming that she is getting the light from the right. So adding a light source like this. Again, not necessary, but sometimes I like to do it in this step. And then I start doing my actual highlights that I always do. I use my lining brush and I use a screen layer. And now I just kind of, well, these are not necessarily perfectly following the actual light source. Right now it's all about just adding more detail to the hair and just make it look more dimensional. So the light is coming from the right, but I'm still adding some highlights here more to the left, just because it will look better, or just because I want to add something here. So I'm not too strict with these. You can see I also use this to kind of define the strands and to kind of move them away from each other. So for example here it was pretty same looking, so what I did is I just added this light kind of highlight to make them be more differentiated. So yeah, that's mainly what I do with these. I think I'm going to soften this one a bit more. I feel like it's a bit too much. What I sometimes like to do is something I also do with skin. So beneath the highlights, I like to make a new layer and set it to screen. And I use a color that is somewhere here, so a really saturated kind of orangey tone. Depending on the hair color, you might want to change this, but I just add some airbrush right here where the skin meets the hair and tone it down a bit. It just adds some more luminosity to that part of the hair you can kind of see. So yeah, that's also something I like to do, but these are the main steps I like to use when shading hair. It's pretty simple and pretty much the same way I approach anything I would shade. So I start with gradients, then go in with a multiply layer, maybe add even more multiply, add some color variation, and then I go in with highlights, and that's it. And you can see I didn't really do much blending here whatsoever. The airbrush is doing most of the work for me, which is great. So yeah, I hope this was helpful. Please leave any more questions that you have down below. I'm going to be attaching the Procreate file for this, so you can go through the layers if you want. But I'm also going to be making like a step-by-step overview, so it's easier and you don't have to listen to all my rambling if you want to go through it again. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching, and thank you guys so much for supporting me, and I'm going to be talking to you down below in the comments. Bye!